All right, to pick up where we left off, we were just diving into the OpenAPI specification, and I had this quick little code sample to show you kind of what it looks like, what you're getting into. This is in a syntax called YAML, which stands for, does anybody know? Wait, multiple people. Did somebody say YAML ain't markup language? Is that what? Okay, yeah. That's what it stands for, because in a markup language you have little angle brackets that are marking up the content. Well, we don't have any of that in YAML. It's just space-sensitive levels of different things. And so for the most part, it should be much more human readable, meaning yeah, you just don't need an editor. You just look at it, you can read it and understand it. In reality, its extreme dependence on spaces can make it very difficult to make it valid sometimes. But you know, once you get it working and once it is valid, it can be a lot easier to kind of update. Some people are nodding their heads when I mention the space sensitivity. It can be a little frustrating, but the alternative is JSON. Really, YAML and JSON are pretty much interchangeable. JSON is actually a subset of YAML. So YAML has a couple of features that JSON lacks. One of them is reusing a definition and some other things. But you have the, yeah?
Is there some editor you recommend that would auto-check?
Yeah. We'll jump into that here in the next slide, I think. You have the option to work in YAML or JSON when you're creating this spec, or entirely in like a GUI editor. My preference is YAML, but somebody who likes JSON might like that better because then you don't have the spaces that will make it invalid. Now, the large question that you're going to run, the big question you're going to run into when it comes to creating this specification is who's going to do it. There's two main philosophies here. One philosophy is that, well, if we embed the right annotations in the code, then developers can generate out this specification document from libraries that have been developed for this, that are particular to that type of code. For example, let's say your API is coded in Java. Well, there are Java libraries that will generate out this Swagger file, this OpenAPI file, if you follow certain annotation syntax within the code. And the annotation syntax will be similar to like Javadoc syntax, where you have certain descriptions and stuff specified. And people refer to this as automatically generating the spec. It's not really entirely automatic. It's not like you just press a button and it's there. But the automated part is like your documentation of some of your like methods and other things are sort of inherent in the code. So there's this argument that, oh, you're gonna have less code drift because you're keeping the documentation right in step with the code. Well, that has been the sort of prevailing model that developers have used documenting APIs forever, right? You don't generate a Javadoc by hand, you generate that out of Java code from annotations. So engineers might like that. They might also not like to do this because then that means they're responsible for documentation, right? Which is yet another thing that they probably don't want to have to worry about. So you as a writer could go in there and like update the annotations or add them or modify them. You know, you could collaborate within their source control, which I'm sure they love. You know, writers jumping in there. I'm going to go ahead and just merge this into the master. Is that all right? Like, or there's another philosophy that's called the spec first philosophy. And I'm a proponent of this philosophy. There's a book called Undisturbed REST, A Guide to Designing the Perfect API by a guy named Michael Stoll, who's actually one of the RAML evangelists, or was, and he wrote this. But the idea is look, if you document your API within the code, well then you've already built the code, right? It assumes that you've put the blueprint for it somewhere else and the developers have built it. Now they just have to go in and document it. Well, what if we could make that blueprint the contract that developers use to build? What if we could avoid the kind of multiple iterations that happen when you just have developers starting to code and then they throw something out there and then it's like, oh, that failed, let's try it again. The idea is that with spec-first development, you create the spec separate from the code before you even touch code. You can prototype it. You can actually have what's called a mocking server, which is not a laughing server. It's a server that imitates a real server and spits out a response so that it looks like a real API. And you can test it with users and say, does this work for you? Does this fit your workflow? Are these endpoints intuitive? And then when everybody agrees, you have this formal specification that serves as the contract or blueprints that you hand to developers who then just code it up, right? This way, you've put the specification first, and hopefully you've got buy-in and agreement, and you've made iterations and refinements before you even start touching code. Because the problem is with APIs is that they don't really fit this fail-fast mentality that is so commonly adopted with Agile. If you implement an API and then people start integrating it into their code, you can't just change it, right, without breaking all the applications that have integrated it. So if you start to make it your new versions backwards compatible, it compounds the complexity. It makes documentation very difficult, right? And it doesn't work so well. It's not like a GUI where, oh, I changed the interface for this and it doesn't matter. So it didn't work. I'll change it again tomorrow. Users won't care. No, we've got actual applications that are depending on these endpoints and the parameters specified in a certain way. So get it right the first time. I guess it's more of a marriage of waterfall with Agile, not just a pure Agile. But anyway, hey, welcome back. Spec first philosophy is one of your two ways to go. You may be in a department where you have like hundreds of APIs to document, and maybe you have engineering teams who want to collaborate and want to document. Well, in that case, yeah, I'd say document in the code, go for it. It depends how much you want to get involved. You may have engineers who simply deliver this document to you. Say, here's my Swagger spec, my OpenAPI spec, publish it. You have to make sense of it. So if that is the case, well, then you can work with that. Does anybody have any thoughts or feedback about which method they prefer, having engineers put annotations in the code that generate the spec or creating the spec manually from the TechPubs team? Anybody? People are very polarized around this, yeah?
Whichever they'll do.
Whichever they'll do?
90% of the time they won't do either.
So my colleague, he's a former engineer, he feels very strongly that when you build an API, it's part of the engineer's responsibility to provide some kind of documentation artifact. And when people built a Java API, they had to deliver a Java doc. It was part of the package. So this idea that, hey, you built a REST API, cool, give me the Swagger spec for it, is not so unreasonable, right? It's like anybody who builds something should have the responsibility to provide some kind of documentation about what they built. So anyway, it depends. I like to have my hands more involved in this than to simply get it generated out, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't jump in the source code and also monkey around in it. Yes, Barry?
Yeah, I heard about this 2 years ago in Prague.
Okay.
Yeah, so I have a colleague there, and he called it doc first.
Oh, okay.
But he made a similar argument that it can work a lot better if you have the tech docs folks with the developers defining it first, and then you agree on that, and then they go code it. It's just going to save a lot of time. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if they don't do it that way, the PM or whoever is the designer has to put the requirements somewhere, and so they'll probably use a wiki, Confluence wiki page or Word doc. And are they going to remember all the details that developers will need to know? Like, oh, is this data type a Boolean or integer or string? And is it required? Is it not required? And is it camel case or is it lower? There's a lot of decisions that are probably just going to be forgotten. So the developer will just be like, oh, I'm going to do it this way. And yeah, it can lead to poor design. if the developer isn't really design savvy. All right, overall, the reason that I mentioned this a little earlier, I just want to hammer home this point. The reason the OpenAPI spec is the way to go is because it provides a standard on this wild west of code. And it guides you through all the little details. You don't really have to remember, oh, I need to have my example request and my example response. No, it's like you're not going to be able to create a valid spec without these things. So it's a way to be thorough. You won't forget to document the data type for each parameter in your response. It simplifies authoring in the same way that forms simplify authoring. If you want to make engineers write, don't give them a blank page, you give them forms that have like templates and structure, and then it's much, much easier. Well, that's how API doc is. So this will make your life easier, not harder. The only way it makes it harder is when the spec is new and unfamiliar and it's like, oh, I can't get the syntax right. But overall, once you get the hang of it, I think you'll find that it's a good sort of anchor and guiding guide through it. In the same way, I mean, it's what a specification standard is really designed to do, is to rally people around a common pattern that exemplifies best practices. Now, not all people use this. Somebody was just telling me that, hey, at Google, we invent everything ourselves and build everything ourselves, and we don't use Swagger at all. It's like, oh, okay. So your company may have a different process, different needs, different approach. And maybe, you know, I don't mean to make this a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. But I think it's gained a lot of popularity. Dan?
Yeah, we seem to have bumped into a couple different problems. The 3.0 issue you mentioned, there's some functionality that our developers want to use that's only available there. Tools don't support it.
Yeah.
And then they're also telling me that, well, we're doing something different. And it doesn't fit the spec. It doesn't.
Yeah.
The spec doesn't do what we want to do.
Yeah, and that could be the case. It just depends. And technology is, there's so many variations, and you know, maybe it's not quite a REST API, and it's a different type of API, and you know, maybe it won't work. People ask me this all the time. They're like, what about this RPC API or this JSON API or something? So yeah, it's part of the challenge of a specification. Like, if you were to describe APIs and write a specification that would like accurately provide a model for every type of REST API to kind of be described by, that's quite a challenge. There are many cases. And for example, with the 3.0 and 2.0 differences, one example that I remember, I believe, is the any of JSON response. Like if a response could contain any one of these 4 types, but not necessarily all of them, there's a JSON schema that is called any of. Well, that's not in the 2.0, but it's in the 3.0. So things like that might get in the way. The other nice thing about the OpenAPI spec is that it standardizes terminology. You may run into all kinds of things about how parameters are referred to and methods, and this sort of gives it some standardization. We talked about this a bit earlier, so I'll just jump past this. Now, somebody was asking, what do you write this in? There is something called the Swagger editor that is one way you can do it. If you go to editor.swagger.io or just search for Swagger editor, you'll find this little dual pane editor. On the left, you can write your code, and on the right, you can see the display. And it caches it, so it saves it. This is what I was working on previously. But if you just go to a new page, I think you see the pet store one. At any rate, this is kind of a neat editor. They call this the Swagger editor, because remember, Swagger refers to the tooling that supports the OpenAPI. If you make a mistake here, let's say, for example, take away a space here, it parses it immediately and says, title, this is not a recognized object at the root level. Bad indentation of a mapping entry, you know, and it's like, hey, jump here and we'll fix it. So
what can you put in here? Is it YAML?
YAML, I believe you can also put JSON. Let's see. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can do JSON or YAML. What I recommend is that, well, go little by little, make changes so that you can see if you broke it before you get too far down in the path where you know where you've gone. At any rate, this is a really handy thing. The output on the right is fully functional. If I come over here to get weather and I try it out, I can actually execute a request. I don't know if I have my API key in here or not. Yeah, I don't have my, oh, there we go. Got to authorize it. When you plug in your spec, you'll be able to come in here and actually make it work. Let me see this over here on the right.
Customize this UI according to your company's look and feel, or?
Oh, this is just an authoring tool. This is not what users would see. This is for you, for authoring. You can download, this is like a package on GitHub. You can download it and run it locally. Try that. It sort of worked. I ran into some hiccup. I don't know. Okay, so the company that makes this tool is called SmartBear, and they have a premium version as well. So if you wanted to collaborate with others and save this document in the cloud, and like even version it, you would use their premium version, which they call Swagger Hub. But it's the same thing, same logic here that you play around with it. You see.
There's no way to track changes?
No, not in this one. There would be in the premium version, yeah. But yeah, everything in YAML is very space dependent. When you have a new level, it's like you put 2 spaces and then, or you put a colon and then 2 spaces indentation, that kicks it out to a new level. In YAML, you can also have lists, and this is denoted by the dash hyphen sign. And this is really, you can convert all this to JSON and see exactly what it would be like. It's just search for YAML to JSON converter and you can see how it maps things. But I think it just takes a bit of getting used to. All right, so if you are building your OpenAPI doc from scratch, I've got a whole tutorial to do this. And this is where we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of this during this course because it gets very tedious. But if you come over here to this OpenAPI tutorial on my site, there are kind of 8 steps that I walk you through. It's not the greatest approach here, but essentially there are 8 root level objects: the OpenAPI object, the info object, servers object, paths, components, security, tags, and external docs. And for example, the OpenAPI one is very easy. This is a sample. This is all it is. You're specifying what version of the API you're using. Right? So if you're using the 3.0, you can specify it here. It doesn't really matter which dot release it is. And how this gets expressed is when you build, or in the OpenAPI, it basically flags it as OAS 3 or OpenAPI spec version 3. Right? So, okay, that would be step 1, simple at this point, right? Then the info object looks like this. Let me increase this size a little bit more. Now I can't see. The info object looks like this. The info can take a title, description, version, terms of service. Where is all this defined? It's defined in the documentation. Let's see if I have a link to it right here. Come on, Tom. It's all defined in GitHub. So if you search for OpenAPI spec GitHub, the documentation is here. And what you would do is look and say, wait, let me get to the documentation first. Here we go. Current version of the OpenAPI spec is 3.02. I'm 1 dot release behind. And you can see all these different objects are defined. You've got the OpenAPI object. Remember, an object is just something that contains like key value pairs. Info, contact. One other note, we're using JSON formatting terminology even in YAML contexts. Don't worry about that. But the info object, here if I look at the official documentation, which conveniently or inconveniently is all in one giant page. The info object, link doesn't seem to work. Okay, well, here we go. Oh, you know what? Sometimes my recording device gets in the way of links. So let me just scan down to this page. Info object. This tells you which fields are available as subfields under this. So you can see here title, description, terms of service, contact, license, and version. These are all possible things that you can have. So in your code, where I have info, I've got title, description, version, terms of service, contact. And if you look back here, contact is itself an object. So it can have a sublevel. These other ones are just strings. So they don't have a sublevel. They just have a string. But contact is an object, so it contains a name and a URL if I were to go down and read this. Learning how to just read this specification documentation, it can make you bleary-eyed and so forth. It takes a while to get the hang of it, but just remember, each of these is an object and it defines what fields are available at that object. And if you keep going through the tutorial, this one is pretty easy, right? The real difficulty is, and it mostly defines the front matter up at the top. The difficulty comes down to the paths, right? Servers is pretty short. It's just like, what's the base URL that we're going to be appending all these paths onto? And you can have multiple, like if you had different environments that had different paths and so forth. And you get this little widget in the front. But the meat of it is this paths object, and this is where my tutorial is kind of not so great. But the paths starts out with something that looks like this, paths, and then you put your path, which is weather in this case, and then the method, get. So there are 3 different levels there. Paths is the root. And then you would look and see, for example, these are all the different fields that are available for the paths object. If I go to parameters, for example, I think my links don't work because they changed the version on me. All right, sorry, I'm scrolling. I'm just trying to keep this really high level to give you a sense of how you sort through this. So let me get to there's the server object. This next one will be the paths. One sec. There we go, path item object. Here you put the path, curly braces indicate that you're putting your custom thing in here. And then this table describes what are the fields available to be listed under the path. Summary, description, get, and each of these is its own object. See, so you just kind of have to read this thing, and the reason it's one page is because it just jumps down. They wanted to do it like that. That's how I kind of recommend you could go through it. So we start with paths, get. These are all the tags that are valid here. And then I strip away the ones that maybe are not relevant to me and keep adding to it. Like we start with the content. Wait, what am I on? No, I jumped around. Here we go. The tags, define that, summary, description, operation ID, parameters, and so forth. So I'm not going to get into all this detail and have you try to recreate this. This is what will take probably 1 to 2 weeks if you're unfamiliar with the OpenAPI spec. And the way you learn it is by kind of looking at examples of similar APIs that have these and kind of building off yours, or you can follow this tutorial and build it, object by object like this. But that is essentially how you build it from scratch. Now, there are tools to make this easier, which I will also get into. But this is what's daunting to a lot of people, because like all this, all these different levels have to be valid based on the OpenAPI specification and the schema and what's allowed and what's not. So getting all this stuff valid can be a serious pain. But once you do, then you've got it and you've got an example. Then your other APIs just usually follow this example and so forth. Okay, so let's do a sample edit here. We're going to go to activity 4B. Edit an existing OpenAPI specification document. All right, so there's a simple sunrise and sunset API that I decided to use for this example, I think. Why did I use that one? Yeah, oh, okay. Anyway, yeah, for fun, we're going to use this one. And for step 1, you're just going to copy the pre-built OpenAPI specification. So go ahead and open this up, right-click or whatever, save as, and save this OpenAPI sunrise sunset to your desktop. I could have done it with the OpenWeatherMap API, and I'm not sure why I chose it here, but anyway, this is a similar one. I was kind of, in this course, I was trying to have people like build their own, but it's not enough time to build it during this. Okay, so copy the pre-built OpenAPI specification. And then step 2, paste it into the YAML editor. So you'll go to the Swagger editor. You'll go to the Swagger editor, and you can, I guess you don't have to download that at all, do you? Paste it in, all right? And you should see it rendered correctly on the right, assuming there are no errors.
Yay.
This is a really simple API too. I mean, it gets the sunrise and sunset time. It's like not a whole lot to it. All right, now identify each of the root level objects in this. So look for the OpenAPI. This is root level, meaning at the very lowest level here, there's no spaces before it. Here's the info object. Here's the servers object, paths object, components object. Components isn't really one that is meant to stand alone. Oh, and I've got some kind of error. Sibling values are not allowed alongside refs. Yeah, I think this description is unnecessary because it's defined later on. So what components does is it's kind of like your snippet repository in Flare lingo, or it's your includes or whatever. Instead of defining, for example, all of my sample response here in this part of the spec, I'm just going to refer to it. I'm going to refer to it with this reference, the $ref, and now the Swagger editor is going to look down here under components, schemas, and find this reference and insert all the stuff under it into that spot. So here's what enables reuse. And this can be really powerful if you have like lots of APIs that are reusing things. And you can put not just your sample responses here, but parameters, because obviously you probably have very similar parameters across many APIs. And some other security information, you can store it there as well. So it's a nice way to reuse things, and that's what 3.0 kind of takes to another level, is this amount of reuse.
And that's done through the ref element?
Yeah, which is actually like an official JSON tag. It's not like a custom thing by OpenAPI.
Would that be an external link, not simply within this file?
I believe so. Different tools might have different constraints, but yeah, I think the idea is that you could actually split this out. I'm not so sure you could do it here in this editor, but maybe locally. But yeah, there's some, I think Handyman API has a whole tutorial on that. Okay, so you've identified all these. Now, in the info object and the parameters object, go look for the description and just make some changes. So I'm going to go up to just the description here. I'm going to write my name, and I want to see it reflected over here on the right. You can see real time how things changed. And understanding kind of how these fields get parsed and displayed. You know, what happens, what does this contact stuff do? Well, if you were to blank it out, you can see, oh, no, I don't have a link there. Well, this is just the Swagger UI tool and how they choose to portray this information. If you're in another system, like maybe Apiary or some other, maybe you're in MuleSoft, they may put this in a totally different display. It's a complete separation of content from presentation, right? Follows best practices about data and display. And this is really the neat part about this spec, is that once you have a valid spec, you could transform it 100 different ways, and tool vendors can process it in a very predictable, programmatic way because it follows a standard. If everybody just did it their own way, that wouldn't be possible. So we'll also make an edit in one of the paths, or the parameters or something, did I say? We'll do an edit, all right, sunny weather in the lat parameter, and then try to identify how that gets updated. You can see here the lat parameter, the description value, it was updated. There you can see sunny weather. When I'm working with one of these files, I will often go back to the GitHub documentation and review to see what fields are available with the parameter object again, and what are their data types and so forth. Okay, and let's see. I think I have one more little task here. Oh yeah, so do something that makes it invalid. Take and mess up some spacing. For example, I'll take and remove a space under version. You can see an error pops up, bad indentation of a mapping entry, and up at the top it indicates that it's invalid. Now, their parser error messages don't tend to be very helpful sometimes, and it reads it in a top to bottom flow. So if my error's there, but also down here, it is only telling me that there's an error up here. So once I fix this error, then it like keeps reading down. It's like, oh, you had an error down here too, buddy. So it can be kind of frustrating, and it requires a great degree of meticulousness to get this all valid and accurate. Okay. Questions, thoughts?
Why do they allow that? Should have a restriction of
Not being able to change the indentation of those fixed objects, because there's no point of, like what you just did, you move version ahead in one space. Maybe they can add some sort of restriction so it doesn't even let you do that.
Yeah, well that kind of leads into our next activity, I think. The tooling, well, we're going to come up to that here in a minute. Once you have this, yeah, you're right? Like, why give people a free-form editor that lets them hang themselves with their own rope? There's some tools that make it a lot easier that I think might be highly worthwhile. The what? Oh, the
XML would help.
Yeah. Okay, so when you create this OpenAPI spec, you can do more with it than just create interactive docs. That's only one part of the OpenAPI spec. You can also auto-generate the client SDK code. Remember the specific way that you would implement an API in a particular language? You can generate out all the code files that people would need to implement your API in Java or Python or something. You could use this as a sales demo. People come in and they see this API and they can easily salespeople can talk through this at conferences. People really like that. You can do prototyping. So before you even code the API, you can have people test it out. You can even do A/B testing and say, well, does this work for you? Does this have the responses you would want? Testers can do unit testing out of this, so testing each of the components by itself. Each of these APIs, there are tools like RunScope that will go through and just like process the information in a document like that and do some testing. And then of course it acts as the contract, right? This is like what developers agree to code to, and there's no ambiguity around that. Swagger UI is the name of this display framework that can read and parse this OpenAPI spec, but it is just one way of doing it, right? And if I go to this, here's the Open Weather Map API. This was that weather map that we were using earlier when you had the developer hat on. They didn't do their docs like this, right? I only did one endpoint for them. And you can see how, whether or not this makes sense. Now, one challenge for this API is that, well, you don't use all these parameters. You would only pass like the city ID or the latitude and longitude or the zip code. And there's not a clear way to tell people that like you can't use all these parameters at once. So this is kind of the shortcomings of it. There's also some challenges with the Swagger UI around the expand collapse styling. I know this sounds like, oh, this is an easy fix, but if I switch over from example value to the model or the schema, it tries to package in the descriptions with sample values, and it's kind of a mess, to be honest. But if I expand wind, I can see that wind would contain speed and let's say, oh, I thought it said dog. I was like, what? Degree. And it sort of puts the description with the sample value and the data type here, which is kind of cool that it tries to put it all together. But it only displays well if this Swagger thing is allowed to expand in the full frame. It's a liquid display. If you try to constrain this in a fixed way, these little guys just expand outside the frame. I played with this for quite a while because I wanted to kind of do almost like an iframe with this, or just an embed into another dock system, and this is really problematic. Anyway, this is their approach. Different tool vendors will do this differently. Anyway, this is the most basic one. You can sorry, what am I trying to say? You can skin this. You can change this fairly easily. There are also some parameters you can change. Like by default, a section at the bottom will appear called models that you can hide and so forth. All right, now we're going to jump into some alternative tools to display it, but before we do, you should just have a basic understanding about how to build that display from the spec file. And it turns out it's drop dead easy. Well, not drop dead, it's easier than it might appear. Okay, so we're going to do activity 4C for this. And I guess I'll walk you through this as well. We can do it sort of together. Okay, so, and we are going to use the Open Weather Map one for this file. That's why I switched it. Okay, so step number 1, prepare a valid OpenAPI specification document. Right? We're going to assume that you did this, or we're not going to do this right here, right? But this would be the first step, because this Swagger UI tool is just going to display this file. So basically, you see the second bullet here, to use a pre-built OpenAPI spec, download one of these. So you can control-click, save link as or something, and save this file. It's OpenAPI_weather.yaml. Save it somewhere. All right. Step 2. Make sure the spec is valid. So let's just check that it's valid so that we don't run into issues. I'm going to open up Swagger Editor. This file that I downloaded, I'm just going to paste it in there and make sure that we don't have any kind of issues. Nothing red is flagging. It's going to be good. Okay. Step 3, go to the Swagger UI GitHub project. This project is an open source project, the Swagger UI. You find it here. Click clone or download and choose download zip. And then uncompress that wherever you hit it. The only folder that we're going to work with in here is called dist, short for distribution. So you can, yeah, sorry, I'm going too fast. Swagger UI, click download, yeah, the green button, and then choose download zip. Uncompress the zip file. The only folder that matters in here is dist, so just to simplify things, I'm going to just drag dist onto my desktop or whatever, wherever you want to put it, or you could just leave it in there. All right. Okay, so I'll slow down a little bit, make sure everybody's to that point. All right. Let me make sure. Does everybody have the Swagger UI project downloaded? Anybody? Okay. Now, inside the dist folder, you're just going to drag your YAML file that you downloaded earlier, the OpenAPI_weather map, into that folder. All right? So it should look like this. Basically, you have OpenAPI weather map. Okay, step 7, open up something like Sublime Text or whatever text editor you like, and then inside the dist folder, open your index.html file. Okay. In this file, scroll down and look for this line right here where it says URL. And you're just going to put a reference to the YAML file. What do we call it? It's OpenAPI_openweathermap.yaml. So I'm just going to copy the name. All right. .yml. That is all you need to do for a basic configuration. Are you guys with me? Do I need to? You look for the URL parameter under like window.onload, and then change that to just point to your YAML file, to your own one. By default, it has the pet store YAML. Now, Chrome doesn't allow certain things to happen locally, but Firefox does. So for the sake of simplicity, if you have Firefox or Edge, I believe, go and open up this file, in this index.html file that's in your dist folder. If you go to, let's see, just open up the index in the browser, and there you go. If you open this in Chrome, Chrome will say, like warning, CORS request, not going to allow cross-origin stuff. It'll block it. Or you could just upload this to a web server, or you could run like a simple HTTP server locally, but Firefox is probably the easiest. So if you don't have Firefox, don't worry about it, but you might want to download it really quickly. I should have put it on the prereqs or something. But so now you've got it locally, and it should all work. I mean, you could deliver this. So if your engineers hand you this Swagger file, that's all you really have to do to make it publishable. Then you could just upload this to a server. Of course, this would not be integrated into the rest of your docs, but this is kind of the default. Who has been able to be successful in getting this to display on their local machine? Just 2 people? All right, where are you guys getting stuck? No? You getting a fetch error? Are you in Firefox?
Chrome.
You're in Chrome. Try Firefox. Yeah, Chrome has some kind of security thing that's fairly recent, I think, on this. Yeah, you might have to download Firefox if you don't have it.
I got it to work. It's
You
just
got it to work? Okay.
typo.
Okay. Now, the other thing, if you don't want to download Chrome, you could actually use a path to a resource online. So if you have HTTP something here, it'll work locally in Chrome.
Yeah, Firefox is working.
Okay.
So you were saying before about the formatting challenges with this. So if you tried to embed this into like an iframe or something in another page, that's when it screws up, where the expanding doesn't work.
Yeah, I should probably shouldn't have said iframe because I haven't really tried the iframe, but I imagine that was going to be terrible in general.
Yeah.
If you just take and copy this, wait, where did it go? If you take and copy this code and all the references into another display,
Right.
another frame, it really wants to have the full expansion power. It was not as simple. That said, they recently redid this to make it more embeddable, and I still think it embeds okay. It depends, whoops, where am I? It depends how complex your response is. Like, if your response here has like 1 million different levels, then you might be in trouble. But if you only have a few levels, it's not going to be that much of a problem. Like, this is a simple one.
Is that a 3.0 thing?
Yeah, I think, well, Swagger UI is independent of the OpenAPI in terms of this display, but this is, Swagger has its own version. What version are they at? Confusingly, they're at like 3.19.5 or something, but yeah. This has nothing to do with, it doesn't correlate with like OpenAPI 3.0, which I found very odd, but there are also some parameters you can set in Swagger UI. Like, let's say you wanted this section to be open by default. Well, you could set a parameter in there that specifies that. So there are a few others, like you want the model down here to be shown or not. Yeah. All right, anybody else have success or not success? Would this be something that would work in your scenario? Why or why not?
I'm wrestling developers to create the initial files.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and okay. Anybody else have thoughts, feedback?
Question.
Yeah.
It looks like everything's in quotation marks. Is that just how you're specifying values in a YAML file like this?
It's somewhat optional.
Okay.
If you have any kind of string that has a colon in itself, like a title part 3, getting started, then YAML gets confused because YAML recognizes the colon as like a start. It's a red character in YAML. It indicates something, so it will indicate a bad mapping entry. And if you have quotes around it, it makes it safe. Yeah, but I think quotes around strings in general are optional in this whole spec. Okay.
So if this whole thing were, you could embed this as a link in another, right? So you click it and it would open in its own page or tab or whatever.
Yeah, and this is where a lot of people are. What's the word? They don't like the fact that their docs are fragmented.
Yeah.
They want to have everything together, right? Maybe you want to reuse a definition of a parameter in your tutorial, right? Well, this is a limitation. Very few systems integrate these two. But if you think about it like this, in the days of Java docs, developers had a Java doc file that was a standalone file, and then you had your user guide that was its own file. And it's kind of nice to have all the reference information in its own space. That's a quick way to go and refer to the data type or parameter or whatever without having to sort through the whole mess of docs. So having it as a standalone discrete output is not the end of the world. There are tools, though, that will integrate them. So let's jump into that. Unless we have any more thoughts or questions about the Swagger UI part. Okay, tools to process the spec. As I said, once you have this spec, lots of different tools can read it. The Swagger UI is just kind of the default one. And here are some other options. This is Swagger Hub, and they have like a premium version of Swagger UI. So they're trying to, give you features here that you wouldn't get from the default Swagger UI. And what are those features? Well, surprise, they don't yet support 3.0 in the coolest way that they could. Let me go to this real quick.
Can you explain why in the exercise just now, it worked in Firefox but not in Chrome?
Yeah, to the best of my understanding, it's a CORS objection, which means that JavaScript is being shared on two different sources, and that could be a potential security conflict. So Chrome might think that a malicious person could take and stick a reference to a JavaScript file on some remote host and pull in malicious code, and so it's blocking that, saying, no, that's from an origin that's not part of the rest of your code, I think.
Something in that, because it's referencing that index file?
Yeah, it's referencing, as soon as you upload that whole thing onto a web server, it's not going to complain. Or if you were to replace that URL with a full HTTP path to it, it's not going to complain. But if you open up, let me just open this up in Chrome. If you open up the developer console, it will tell you the type of error that it has here. URL scheme must be HTTP or HTTPS for CORS request. This is cross-origin resource sharing. It's a JavaScript security thing. Yeah, if I replace that guy with a HTTP version where this resource is located and refresh it, it's not going to complain at all. I don't know why Firefox allows it. It's different browser security standards. Okay, so yeah, sure. Swagger Hub, I have a whole section here. They sponsored my site, and I was like, oh, cool, I'll write a tutorial and I'll put it in here for you. But they have, I want to show you a demo, if I could remember where I put it, of the 2.0. It gives you kind of more tooling around this, but I have a 2.0 version. Here we go. Just to give you a demo. Whoops. Design view, preview docs. I guess I'm not finding it. Basically, you have a bunch of options up here to generate your SDKs in different languages. So that's kind of the main thing. Stoplight is another tool, and this is going to make things quite a bit easier, and I actually have a whole activity we'll do with this in a minute. This is something that I think is really useful. But here's a demo of how they kind of parse and display their docs. This is Shopgate Developer Center, and you can, if I come in here, you can see that they have a whole different look and feel to things. I need to actually load an API, but once I do, they've taken and parsed this in their own way with their own styling, and they're reading this from the spec. Another tool is README. This is a tool created by a guy around here who got a lot of funding and did an amazing job. He's a really talented UI designer, and a lot of companies are actually using this. Not the best demo here with this being blank, but basically it's this 3-column display if you want, and it might look better in different, yeah, anyway. But the cool thing about README, readme.io, if you're looking for a way to kind of read this spec and add your other documentation, it combines the two. So you no longer have to have like a separate output. You can have your user guide information in the same space. And it's quite a nifty tool. It allows you to kind of author everything in a GUI as well, for the most part, and kind of mixes some text fields with forms in a way that works out quite well for people, and it's pretty cheap. Spectacle is this is another tool that will just basically read your OpenAPI file. If you configure it with the URL to your OpenAPI spec, it'll spit something out that looks like this. It doesn't let you add any more information. It gives everything on one page. But right out of the box, in an open source way, you can have like an output. Right? A couple more. API-Matic. This is another tool that I usually use them to transform specs and so forth from one version to another, but they also have documentation. And they kind of have an interesting setup where you can read it in all these other different languages based on the version that you want. All right, so here's the last thing we're going to do in this section, and then we'll take a break because I think we have snacks out there too. We're going to work with the OpenAPI spec in Stoplight. This is 4D. All right, so let me come back to my... I really like Stoplight. I should admit they're also a sponsor on my site, but I like them because they provide more of a practical editor for developing the spec. In fact, at work, some engineers were creating the Swagger file. They used Stoplight. Okay, so go to step one. Okay, download this 2.0 version of the spec. See where it says download this 2.0 OpenAPI JSON file already converted? That's because, as I said, it only has support the 3.0. It's like, oh man. Anyway, download this guy. Go to next.stoplight.io. And you should already have signed in, or already have an account there if you did the prereqs. If not, sign in with your GitHub account. Okay, go to click New Personal Project. You can type anything, workshop, test, whatever. It can be public or private, doesn't matter. Click Next. Now, it's asking you for a file. So click Import Existing, and then click Upload OpenAPI, Swagger, Markdown, or HTML file. This is next.stoplight.io, new personal project. Right, and so this is a web app. They also have a standalone rich client app. You can hardly tell the difference. Go ahead and select that file that you downloaded, the 2.0 JSON one. And then when you do, the little button changes to plus, add, whatever your file was named, right? Click that, and now you have a whole GUI to work with the information. You can see it already populated, right? So I've kind of started you out, but you could start this from scratch. And here, this is basically the info object behind the scenes. You've got other things like the scheme. Did I say scheme? The server object and so forth is defined here. And they're trying to remove the complexity of having to know the spec. If you want to see it, you can click code up here at the very top, and you can see all the code behind it. And you can actually make changes to the code. If you go into the description object, write your name or whatever, and then toggle, and we'll save it, confirm, and then toggle back to the design, you can see that it's fully interchangeable there. You can work in the code view, work in the GUI, and it's seamless. And that is pretty amazing. But Once you import that in the paths, you'll see whether this is the only endpoint, and then you can click it. And now you see like, oh, here's the request. We have 8 query parameters, and you can work with it in this GUI, which isn't showing up very well here due to space. But you can come in here and define the different data types and everything, all from a GUI, and not even have to know the spec. Their idea is that the spec should be it should be something that like lots of people collaborate on. The project manager, you want to have people who are making the business requirements decisions, and they're not going to be techies. So we don't want to put them in this really complex YAML syntax code. We want to give them a GUI so they design it right. They get in here and they're playing around, and they can design it. It's a design tool. Oh, there we go.
Do you know if you can save these to a domain other than stoplight.io?
Yeah, you could work entirely within this editor, and when you're done, just grab the code and then take it wherever you want. So, I mean, yeah, you don't even have to use their tool. Now, they have like a whole docs solution where you could add your user guide docs in addition to this, and it combines them, and that's how they probably make money. But yeah, you could just use their editor. Now, here's the one, honestly, the greatest feature of this. The reason I will come back to them is because they have this auto doc feature for the response that I think is pretty cool. If you scroll down here to the responses section, you'll see that, and if you click editor or just viewers, you can see that it uploaded our sample response, right? Now, if you had gone through and manually described this in YAML, you would be, you would realize that like trying to describe the JSON response can be very tricky. So go ahead and click raw schema and delete what's there, right? Pretend we don't have what's there, then click another tab so that you don't have anything between the brackets. It'll populate these little brackets back, all right? We're gonna automatically generate the needed documentation based on a sample response. So if I come back to the workshop activity, go to step number, this is under automatically generate schema documentation, the big sample response, which you could also grab from Postman or something. Copy this, all right? This is almost like a magic trick, so make sure everybody's with me. Copy this block, go back into this editor, click generate from JSON. I'm just gonna paste it in, click generate, and now automatically wrote all this stuff. It's like, oh, this is a object with a type number and this is a subproperty and so forth. Automatically wrote all this. You wouldn't have to do anything. So really, like if you're creating this spec, this is a super easy way to at least automatically generate the response schema. Okay.
Wait, and it's based on that JSON code that you had on your website?
Yeah, well, that was just a sample response for this.
Sample response.
Yeah, sample
So
response.
you have to write that once?
Well, you'll get the sample response from your API. So like you would just like in Postman, whatever an endpoint returns, you have that response. You can just plug that in here and click auto generate. Okay, talked about the integration challenges, so I'm not going to hit that again. Any questions about OpenAPI or Swagger? Yes.
So so sometimes like descriptions or other fields are really long.
Yeah.
And not necessarily description, but you want to add something a little beefier. Can you reference a markdown file?
Potentially. I'm not sure which fields accept the reference. They probably do. And if they do, you might be able to store that separately. I'm not entirely sure. So you'd have to investigate. But I mean, you probably wouldn't want something too long, because then how would that fit into the display? Like if you open it up and it's like, whoa, this parameter is like 7 pages long. So I don't know, maybe it would make sense or work, or maybe you're trying to reuse the description across docs. So that could be a case, but yeah, you'd have to figure that out.
We somehow created a YAML file that basically lists
Okay.
that component section
Yeah.
you had was a list of a bunch of markdown files that pulled in all of the content.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know how
I-
it did, but it's in there.
I have a whole section on integration challenges, integrating Swagger UI with the rest of your docs. And you know, one option is you embed it in there. I talked about that and how it's kind of wonky. You can actually use like collapse and expand sections in there if you integrate jQuery with a reference. It just works. You can parse the OpenAPI with your own tool. Like if you have Jekyll, it's just reading a YAML file. You can write your own, and somebody actually shared a bunch of code for how to do this. I haven't really tried that myself. As you said, you could have these YAML files be the single source of truth that like pull in information stored elsewhere. So there's some different options, or just leave it as standalone. But yeah, it's a challenge, but I think the benefits of writing in the spec outweigh any kind of fragmentation issues. Yes, Bridget. Or Jessie. Why did I call you Bridget? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
Okay.
Do you find that folks are, what are folks typically authoring in? So you're writing this stuff in a YAML file, right? This is what we're doing.
Yeah.
We're getting the information either from the tool, from our engineers, writing it ourselves, whatever we're doing. Got to put these YAML files together. And
Yeah.
so, do you know if people are tending to use one of these tools?
I think Stoplight is gaining a lot of momentum, in part because in reality, trying to write in a text editor or even with the Swagger editor, the YAML file from scratch manually is too prone to error. You get too focused on the syntax. It's like, why, this is not right. Not focused enough on the content. So, you know, while I love to work in raw text formats, so you know exactly what's going on, the GUI editor lets you focus on the content, which could be a lot more valuable. And really, I mean, when you're working on documentation, do you want to be so hyper-focused on syntax and like what's allowed at every level, or do you want to just kind of remove that layer and say, I'm going to focus on the content of what I'm saying? So I think Stoplight has a lot of momentum. That said, like this is an engineering sort of domain, and people like to work in code because you want to know very specifically what's allowed, and so I think that's also popular. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I don't know there's one standard. Yes?
So after you make your changes in Spotlight and then you take that raw text file, can you copy it and just paste it
Yeah.
back into the original? It doesn't
Yeah.
drag any extra.
Yeah, once you're in, note that it likes to work in JSON. So if you're in Stoplight and you're done making all your changes, you can copy this. And if you want to make it into a YAML file, you just go to, convert YAML to JSON, whatever. And there's like a dozen different converters. And then it should all be good. Or you can just paste this. Like, let's say you wanted to work in Swagger Editor again. Paste this guy right into Swagger Editor, and you should be rocking and rolling.
So Spotlight doesn't have a publishing element?
Stoplight?
Stoplight.
Anyway, it does have a publishing element. You can totally publish. I'm just saying, if you didn't want to buy into Stoplight, you didn't want to buy their package or whatever, you just wanted to use their editor to write, you could. Right. But yeah, they've got a full service, and I think they have a great platform as well.
But out of what you're just showing there, you have to take the code that they generate and put it into something else before.
Yeah. And you have that hassle that, it's using 2.0, not 3.0, and it's in JSON, but you live with it. All right, so we've been hammering away at this for a while. Let's go and take a 15-minute break. There should be food out there, snacks of some kind, and come back at, let's say, 2:20-ish, and we'll go through the non-reference part, the user guide part of API docs.